Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are going to be covering a very large topic that is world religion, and I'm going to be attempting to answer two questions. The first one, are all religions essentially the same? And then the second one, do all roads lead to God? Now, first, I just want to start off by saying I'm not an expert in this topic. There's people who literally study world religions as like their main field of study. That is not me. I have dabbled in it. I've studied a little bit of every world religion. So my goal today is to just share what I've learned, but I am still learning. So please have grace with me. And I encourage you guys after this to go do some deeper studies yourself. But the goal of today is just to be an intro to the main world religions and their basic teachings. Okay, so the first question we are going to address is, do all roads lead to God? So making the statement that all paths or all religions lead to God, I think we have an image in our head like this, that there's all these different religions or paths, and in the end, they're all going to lead to this one being called God. So whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist, it doesn't matter because we're all going to end up in the same place anyway. In reality, however, these arrows should be going the opposite direction because the way in which one defines God or whatever worldview someone has lead to completely different ways of life and end up being so different that it's impossible that all of these paths could be leading essentially to the same place. So, for example, let's just look at how each of these religions defines God. So, a Christian believes in the Trinitarian God, which is the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and Jesus was God. Jesus is divine. A Jew also believes in one God, and that one God is Yahweh. A Muslim believes that Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet, but that Jesus was not God. A Hindu actually has over 350 million gods. They are polytheistic. And a Buddhist, when you really look at it, has no God. So, just by the way in which these different worldviews are defining who God is, it is impossible to say that they are all true and they're all leading essentially to the same God that is in the middle. Rather, how they are defining God is leading to completely different ideas and completely different pathways. And you can do this exercise with any aspect of belief. Another one that's interesting to do is salvation. Looking at how each religion understands how one is saved. Christianity will say that it is faith alone and not by works, whereas a Muslim will say, no, it's by works, but ultimately up to Allah. And a Buddhist will say it's just trying to become nothing. So very different and very impossible that all of these ways are essentially leading to the same thing. So no, all religions do not lead to God. In fact, the opposite is true. How you define God and whatever worldview you hold is going to lead to a completely different outcome and a completely different path. Okay, so now we're going to move on to where the bulk of our time will be spent today, and that is going to be on the question, are all religions essentially the same? And my hope is that by the end of our time today, you will be able to confidently answer no. I think that a lot of people are under this assumption that all religions are essentially the same because all religions are attempting to answer four main questions. And those questions are origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Where did we come from? What's the meaning of life? What is right and wrong? And where are we going after we die? However, just because they're attempting to answer the same questions does not mean they're answering them the same. And that's kind of what that chart was showing. So today, we are going to get through some of the leading world religions. And for each of them, we are going to address the history of them, where they came from, how they answer those four questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, and then where they went right and where they went wrong. What do I mean by that? Well, it's very interesting because when you start to look at every world religion kind of has this biblical idea that it took and it twisted. And the Bible actually says that the enemy is a deceiver. And I actually think that's what all of these other religions are, is they are a taking of truth and twisting it into something completely different, which leads to a way that is not of God. And I think it's good to acknowledge where these religions get it right, but then also to see where they get it wrong, because that can help us create a bridge to communicate with them. So, Let's jump into it. First, we're going to start out with Christianity just to make sure we're all on the same page. So first, origin. God created man, and man sinned and then was separated from God. Meaning, the meaning of a Christian life is to put your faith in Jesus Christ and then share the good news of forgiveness for sins and bring God's kingdom to earth. Morality. As Christians, we believe that God defines morality. And this morality is expressed in the Bible, which we view as having the ultimate authority. So as a Christian, the Bible is the ultimate authority. No person, no preacher, no other book. It is the Bible alone. And then destiny. As Christians, we hold that if one places their faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus, then they will spend the rest of eternity in heaven, and then eventually on the new heaven, new earth. But if one does not put their trust in Jesus, they will end up in eternal separation from God in hell. Christians also hold that Jesus is divine, so he is the second person of the Trinity. Jesus is God, and this will become a point of contention with many other world religions, so that's just important to keep in mind. We also hold to the Trinitarian God. Okay, so that's Christianity. Let's move on to Judaism. So first, let's start out with the history of Judaism. If you are a Christian, then the Jewish history is your history because the Jewish people believe everything up until Jesus. They acknowledge the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, so the Law and the Covenant, as well as some of the historical narratives such as the Exodus or the creation stories. Where they differ from Christians is that they do not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. In fact, they are still awaiting the Messiah to come from the line of David to restore the temple. There's varying views actually on who the Messiah will be, what he will do, but I think the traditional view is that the Messiah is still coming and he will bring in a messianic period of peace and restoration to the temple and Israel. So, origin, Jewish people hold the same as Christians that God created man, man fell, and sin entered the world, meaning they would understand the meaning of life to be to live in a correct relationship with God through the covenant. So, they're still adhering usually to the Old Testament laws. Specifically, if you are an Orthodox Jew, this would be like the laws of kosher, the Sabbath, things like that. Morality would also be determined by God through the Torah. And then the Jews also have something called the oral traditions, which can be basically understood as like a fence around the law. So you have the law, which is the commands of God, and then they had all of these oral traditions that would basically help people to not even get close to breaking the law of God, if that makes sense. So they have the Torah, which is the law of God, and then the oral tradition, which would also help determine morality. And then finally, destiny. Now, because the Old Testament is very ambiguous and doesn't say much about the afterlife, so also Jewish people don't really have a unified stance on what the afterlife will be like. Some people will hold that there is like the traditional heaven and hell. Other people believe in some just sort of like spiritual afterlife. So if you're ever engaging with a Jew, I would just ask them. That's the easiest thing to do because there is no like unified stance on what it is. So where did Jews get it right? They obviously get it right in everything up until Jesus. But where they go wrong is they do not acknowledge that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. So that is very briefly Judaism and what they believe. Let's move on now to Islam. So just to start off, the word Islam actually means to submit, and the word Muslim actually means one who submits to God. I think that these definitions actually sum up the Islamic faith very well because the entire goal of a Muslim's life is to submit to the will of Allah. And the core of their belief is that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. So let's dive into the history of Islam. So the Prophet Muhammad was born 570 years after Jesus. So by the time that Muhammad comes on the scene, Christianity is already a thing. Now Muhammad was part of an animistic culture and his tribe specifically worshipped the moon god. And he lived in Mecca. And because of the nature of his job, he would have been encountering many different people who were traveling through, including Christians and Jewish people who would have introduced him to the idea of monotheism. So monotheism isn't completely radical for the time. However, it would be radical to his people and his culture. So one day, Muhammad goes out to a cave to meditate when a being of light appears to him. And this being starts to give him revelations. Now, initially, Muhammad believed that this being was a demon. But after telling his family members what had happened, they convinced him that no, this is not a demon, this is actually an angel or God. So now it is understood that the being of light was the angel Gabriel. And the revelations that Muhammad was receiving from the angel Gabriel end up being written down into what is now the Quran. And the main thing that the Quran teaches is that there is only one God, which, like I said, would have been very controversial to the culture around him. So eventually Muhammad starts preaching this, it's not popular, and he ends up fleeing to Medina, where he gains a following of around 10,000 people. And then once his following is so big, he ends up going back to Mecca and overthrowing the city. Now, one of the main places in Mecca is the Kaaba. It is a place of prayer or worship, and it's just this box. Maybe you've seen it, and it becomes extremely important to the Islamic faith. But initially, the Kaaba was a place of worship for pagan gods and polytheistic gods. However, when Muhammad comes back to the city, he overturns it and makes it a place of worship for the Muslims. So at this time, Muhammad is functioning both as a prophet and a general. There is no separation of politics and religion at this time, so he is leading this nation. And after Muhammad dies, his father-in-law Abu Bakr takes over. However, there was a disagreement amongst the people about whether or not it should have been his father-in-law Abu Bakr who should have taken over, or Muhammad's son Ali, who should have taken over. And this is kind of the start of a very long history of dissension between the Islamic people. Maybe you've heard of the Sunni and the Shia people, but this is where that dissension kind of starts between them. And it's a long history. I'm not going to get into it. I don't think that's really what our time is about today. But yes, after this, Islam begins to spread rapidly and maybe even violently. They do have a history of militant spreading and even forceful spreading of the religion, but now Islam is one of the largest world religions to this day. So now let's move on to what they believe. So Islam will actually acknowledge 4 books. A lot of people will think that they only acknowledge the Quran, but this is not true. They actually acknowledge the Torah, the Psalms, the Injil, which is the Gospels, and the Quran. And the Quran is seen as the holiest book, as it is the last revelation, meaning that anything God said in the Quran supersedes anything that came before. Wait a second, I thought that the Muslims didn't believe in the Bible. Well, they would say that the 3 biblical sources, specifically the Torah and the Injil, have been corrupted. So anytime the Torah or the Injil is teaching something that is contrary to Islamic belief, they would say those are the parts that have been corrupted. For example, the Old Testament teaches that Abraham has 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael, and Isaac becomes the son of the promise. However, Islam would say, no, it's Ishmael that is the son of the promise. And this is because the Arabic tribes actually descend from Ishmael, not Isaac, and the Muslim people are Arabic. So yes, they acknowledge 4 books, but the Quran is the holiest, and anywhere that the biblical accounts disagree with the Quran is where they have been corrupted. So how do they view the Quran? So the Quran is said to be dictated by God, which means that it is word for word what God spoke to Muhammad, and that leaves no room for any sort of error, whether that's grammatical or theological. The Quran kind of functions as the framework to Islamic belief, but actually about 80% of what Muslims actually do are actually derived from the example of Muhammad. Well, how do they know what Muhammad did or said? Well, this can be found in what's called the Hadith. And the Hadith is a collection of the sayings and the actions of Muhammad. Some of them are very accurate, where others are more kind of like gossip. But still, the example of Muhammad is extremely important to the Islamic faith, and the Muslims strive to follow after him. Okay, let's talk for a minute about what the Muslims believe about Jesus and also what the Quran actually teaches about Jesus. So the Muslims have a very high regard for Jesus because they believe that he was a prophet of Allah, but not the final prophet. They also deny the divinity of Jesus. So the Quran actually teaches that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he performed many miracles, and that he ascended into heaven, so he never died, and he will come again to judge the world with the Gospels and the Quran in his hands. So very interesting. I think a lot of people don't understand the role of Jesus in the Islamic perspective. So the main issues that the Muslims are going to have with Jesus and with Christians is the concept that Jesus died and resurrected, especially when Christians are claiming that Jesus is God, because they would say, well, God can't die. So there's no way that Jesus could die on the cross. Another issue they have is with the Trinity. They would say that Christians are polytheistic because there's no way God can be three in one. So they reject the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and they say that he simply just ascended. And they also reject his divinity, and they reject the Trinity. So now we'll move on to, what does a Muslim actually do? What are their practices? And these all come from the 5 pillars of Islam. So the 5 pillars are the Shada. This is a statement of faith that is recited by Muslims over and over, and it goes like this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. The next thing is Salat, or praying 5 times a day. So Muslims will pray at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and evening. And when they will pray facing Mecca. Then there's the Psalm, which is fasting during the month of Ramadan. So during the month of Ramadan, Muslims will fast from sunrise to sunset. And then there's the zakat, which is almsgiving, and this is usually around 2 to 3%. And then finally, the Hajj. This is the pilgrimage to Mecca. So at some point in every Muslim's life, so long as they have the financial means and the physical means to do so, they are to go to Mecca and complete the Hajj around the Kaaba. So that's that box we talked about. And when they're making this 7 times around this box, they're doing things like prayer and worship. So let's review the 5 pillars of Islam. A Muslim must first confess that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. They must pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. They must fast during the month of Ramadan. They must give 2 to 3% of their income, and then they must complete the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca. So now let's go over how they answer those 4 main questions. Origin. Muslims believe that Allah created man, and that actually every person is born Muslim, and anyone who is not Muslim now is actually in a state of rebellion. Humans are also born with a clean slate. They're not born sinful, and they have the choice to either do what is right or what is wrong. Meaning, the meaning of a Muslim's life is to submit to the will of Allah and bring Allah's kingdom to earth, and then also to live a good life in order to hopefully end up in paradise someday. Morality. Morality is determined by the Quran and the example of Muhammad. However, it's a little complicated to interpret the Quran and derive morality from these sources because, one, the miracle of the Quran is said to only be present in its original translation in Arabic. And many Muslims actually don't speak this language, so they are going to their imams or teachers to help them interpret and understand what the Quran is actually saying. And then 2, these interpretations can be difficult to make because there are places where the writings contradict themselves. However, the Muslims wouldn't see this as an issue because they would say that Allah can do whatever he wants, including change his mind. So, in the places where there is contradiction, they would say that whatever the last thing that was said is what goes. Now, as Christians, we would see this as problematic because anytime God is changing his mind, it's suggesting that God is imperfect. But also, it's suggesting that God is unknowable. If God is constantly changing or able to change, we would never be able to know him because one day he's this and the next day he's that. So anytime a religion is having a God that's changing their mind, I would be a little bit weary. So when it comes to the interpretation of the writings, they're often going to their imams to help them determine which is the latest statement of Allah that should be followed. So ultimately, morality is actually just coming from Allah. Whatever Allah says last goes. Destiny. Muslims would say that there is a paradise and then there is a hell. Well, how do you get to these places? In the Muslim belief, each person has 2 angels on their shoulder. One angel recording all the bad deeds and the other angel recording all the good deeds. And when you die, if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, then you get to go into paradise. So essentially, it is salvation by works. However, at the end of the day, Allah actually has the final say on your eternal destiny. Meaning, even if one has their good deeds outweighing their bad deeds, Allah could still choose to send them to hell, because ultimately it is Allah's decrees that go. Okay, so finally, where did they get it right and where did they get it wrong? I think that Muslims get it right in their reverence and submission to the will of God. And I think it's very respectable, the dedication that they have to their faith. And that's something that Christians honestly can learn from. Where they got it wrong, obviously, is in understanding the person of Jesus and with the addition of the Quran to the Torah and the Psalms and the Gospels. So that is a very, very fast overview of Islam. I hope this brought clarity for you, and if you like it, of course, like and subscribe. I hope to do more content like this, and I'll be back with more.